The pressurized seals of the atmospheric scrubbers hissed with a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that echoed through the narrow corridors of the transport vessel Vanguard of the Void. Theron Vance adjusted the grip on his navigation console, his fingers tracing the worn grooves of the manual override switches. He was a man built of hard angles and quiet resolve, his eyes fixed on the flickering holographic projection of the outer reach. The stars here were not the friendly beacons of the inner systems. They were cold, distant pinpricks of light that offered no warmth and even less comfort. Beside him sat Jorah Vane, her sharp gaze scanning the sensor arrays for any sign of the spectral anomalies that had been reported in this sector. They were hunters of the forgotten, scavengers of the debris fields left behind by the Great Expansion, and today they were chasing a ghost. The sensor sweep pinged with a low, thrumming frequency that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that Theron had learned to associate with the presence of ancient, untethered technology. He glanced at Jorah, noting the way her jaw tightened as she adjusted the frequency modulation. They had been drifting through the nebula for 3 standard cycles, fueled by nothing but recycled water and the promise of a payday that could finally get them off this rust bucket and into a legitimate station. The ship groaned as it hit a pocket of ionizing radiation, the internal lights flickering to a dull amber before stabilizing. Theron felt the familiar pull of gravity shifting as the inertial dampeners struggled to compensate for the turbulence of the sector. There were stories told in the low-light bars of New Terra about this specific coordinate, tales of a vessel that had vanished mid-jump, carrying a payload that could rewrite the laws of energy distribution. Most called it a myth, a bedtime story for weary pilots, but the readings on Theron's screen were undeniably real. The nebula surrounding them, a swirling vortex of violet and deep indigo gas known as the Shroud, began to thin as they approached the epicenter of the signal. Theron eased the thrusters back, allowing the ship to glide on its own momentum to avoid detection by any automated defense turrets that might still be operational. The silence within the cockpit was heavy, punctuated only by the soft whirring of the cooling fans and the steady beep of the long-range scanners. Suddenly, the darkness of space ahead of them split apart, revealing a massive, jagged structure that seemed to absorb the very light around it. It was a derelict station, or perhaps a ship of such immense proportions that the distinction was meaningless. Its hull was a patchwork of obsidian plates and translucent crystalline veins that pulsed with a faint, dying luminescence. Jorah leaned forward, her breath hitching as she keyed in a high-resolution scan. The structural integrity of the craft was failing, with massive fractures running along its spine, yet its core was still emitting a concentrated burst of neutrino particles. This was the source of the anomaly, a relic from a civilization that had preceded the current galactic order by millennia. Theron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the life support settings. This wasn't just a salvage op. This was a tomb, and they were about to break the seal. He gripped the steering yoke, his knuckles white against the dark plastic, and began the delicate process of aligning their docking ring with the one viable port visible on the starboard side of the behemoth. As the Vanguard drew closer, the sheer scale of the derelict became overwhelming. It was shaped like a shattered hourglass, its 2 main bulbs connected by a spindly, rotating neck that looked far too fragile to support the mass. Theron could see the scarring on the hull, scratches and gouges that suggested the ship had been through a localized gravity collapse or a relentless bombardment. He maneuvered the transport with the precision of a surgeon, fighting the erratic magnetic fields that tugged at the ship's metallic frame. Jorah called out the distance readings in a steady, rhythmic cadence, her voice the only thing keeping Theron grounded as the massive shadow of the station swallowed them whole. The docking clamps engaged with a bone-jarring thud, the vibration rattling the teeth in Thuron's head. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They sat in the dim light of the cockpit, listening to the metallic groans of the two ships' equalizing pressure. The air in the transport suddenly felt stale and recycled, a stark contrast to the vast, cold emptiness waiting just beyond the airlock. Thuron reached for his environmental suit, the heavy fabric rustling as he pulled it on over his flight fatigues. He checked the seals on his gloves and the oxygen levels in his tank, his movements practiced and efficient. Jorah was doing the same, her expression unreadable behind the transparent visor of her helmet. They both knew the risks of boarding an unmapped derelict, especially one that emitted such a volatile energy signature, but the desperation of their situation left them little choice. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of escaping gas, revealing a corridor bathed in an eerie, flickering green light. Thuron stepped out first, his boots making a dull metallic clack on the floor plating. The air inside the derelict was thin and tasted of ozone and ancient dust. His shoulder-mounted lamp cut through the gloom, illuminating walls lined with complex, geometric carvings that seemed to shift and dance when viewed from the corner of his eye. There was no sign of the crew, no skeletal remains or discarded personal effects, just the hollow, echoing vastness of a machine left running long after its creators had departed. Jorah followed close behind, her pulse rifle held at the ready, her movements fluid and cautious. They moved deeper into the station, passing through massive bulkheads that had been forced open by some internal pressure. The architecture was alien, favoring sweeping curves and organic shapes over the boxy, functional designs Thuron was used to. He kept his eyes on the handheld scanner, which was leading them toward the central core. The neutrino emission was getting stronger now, a rhythmic throb that he could feel in the marrow of his bones. As they reached a wide, circular plaza, the floor gave way to a transparent material that looked down into the heart of the ship. Below them, a massive sphere of swirling dark matter was suspended in a cage of glowing filaments. It was beautiful and terrifying, a captured star or a contained singularity, humming with a power that felt alive. Thuron knelt by the edge of the transparent floor, trying to make sense of the control consoles that lined the perimeter of the plaza. The symbols were unfamiliar, a series of interlocking circles and sharp, angular lines that defied his attempts at translation. However, the interface responded to his touch, the panels lighting up with a soft, amber glow. He could feel the heat radiating from the machinery, a testament to the sheer amount of energy being processed within the core. Jorah paced the perimeter, her weapons scanning the darkened alcoves that branched off from the plaza. She didn't like the silence, nor the way the shadows seemed to linger just beyond the reach of their lamps. She whispered into the comms, her voice crackling with static, warning Thuron that they weren't alone. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat as he saw a flicker of movement in the upper gallery. It was small, quick, and mechanical, a maintenance drone, perhaps, or something far more lethal, designed to protect the core from intruders. Thuron redoubled his efforts to access the station's data logs, his fingers flying across the touch-sensitive surfaces. He needed to find a way to stabilize the core before the entire structure collapsed under its own gravitational weight, but the security protocols were fighting him at every turn. The station groaned again, a deep, structural moan that vibrated through the floor, followed by the sound of metal tearing somewhere deep in the bowels of the craft. A sudden alarm blared, a discordant Teuton wail that echoed through the plaza and sent Thuron into a defensive crouch. From the shadows of the upper gallery, several spindly, multi-limbed constructs began to descend on thin cables of shimmering wire. They weren't maintenance drones, they were sentinels, their central lenses glowing with a murderous crimson light. Jorah opened fire immediately, the bright blue bolts of her pulse rifle illuminating the chamber as they struck the metallic carapaces of the attackers. The sentinels were fast, moving with an erratic, insect-like grace that made them difficult to track. Thuron pulled his own sidearm, a heavy-caliber kinetic pistol, and began picking off the constructs that were flanking their position. The plaza became a chaotic blur of light and sound, the air filled with the smell of scorched metal and the high-pitched whine of energy discharges. Thuron managed to disable two of the sentinels, their bodies sparking and twitching on the floor, but more were emerging from the dark recesses of the ceiling. He realized they couldn't win a war of attrition. They had to get what they came for and get out before the station's defenses overwhelmed them. He turned back to the console, ignoring the chaos behind him, and forced his way through the final layer of encryption. A massive holographic map flared to life, showing the station's internal layout and the location of the primary power cell. It was located just beneath the core, in a reinforced chamber that was designed to survive a total hull breach. "Jorah, the cell is below us," Thuron shouted over the roar of the combat. He pointed to a maintenance hatch near the edge of the plaza, its heavy lid partially obscured by fallen debris. Jorah nodded, throwing a thermal grenade toward a cluster of sentinels to buy them a few seconds of breathing room. The explosion rocked the plaza, sending a shower of sparks and shrapnel into the air. Together, they scrambled toward the hatch, Thuron using his shoulder to shove aside a heavy piece of plating. The hatch was locked, but a quick blast from his pistol shattered the mechanism, allowing them to pry it open. They dropped down into a narrow vertical shaft, sliding down a series of emergency ladders until they reached the sublevel. The air here was much hotter, thick with the scent of ozone and the humming vibration of the singularity core above. The walls were lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with a rhythmic, golden light, feeding the power from the core into the station's remaining systems. At the center of the room sat a pedestal holding a crystalline cylinder, no larger than a man's forearm, which glowed with an intense, steady white light. This was the objective, a zero-point energy cell, a technology thought lost to the ages. It was the key to their future, and the reason they had risked everything to enter this graveyard of stars. Thuron approached the pedestal with caution, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the cell. The air around the device was shimmering with heat haze, and he could feel the static electricity dancing across his skin. As his fingers closed around the cold, smooth surface of the crystal, the entire station seemed to shudder in protest. A low, guttural roar echoed through the chamber, as if the ship itself was screaming in pain. The golden light in the conduits began to turn a violent shade of red, and the floor beneath them started to tilt at a precarious angle. Thuron pulled the cell from its housing, and the primary lights in the chamber immediately cut out, leaving them in the dim, pulsing glow of the emergency strobes. Above them, they could hear the frantic scratching of the sentinels as they tore at the hatch, trying to find a way down. Jorah grabbed Thuron's arm, pulling him toward a secondary exit that led back toward the docking bay. They had the prize, but now they had to survive the escape. The derelict was beginning to tear itself apart, the loss of the power cell triggering a catastrophic failure in the containment fields that held the singularity in check. They ran through the darkening corridors, the station twisting and buckling around them like a dying beast. Thuron could hear the sound of atmosphere venting into space, the high-pitched whistle of air escaping through thousands of tiny fractures in the hull. They reached the main corridor just as a section of the ceiling collapsed, blocking their path with a mass of twisted metal and sparking wires. Jorah didn't hesitate. She used the last of her rifle's charge to blast a hole through a nearby bulkhead, leading them into a parallel service tunnel. The walls here were narrow and cramped, forcing them to move in a half-crouch as they raced toward the docking bay. Thuron's lungs burned with the effort, his vision blurring as the oxygen levels in his suit began to dip into the red. He pushed through the fatigue, his focus narrowed down to the rhythmic sound of his own breathing and the sight of Jorah's back in front of him. They were so close, yet the station seemed determined to keep them within its metallic ribs. A massive tremor threw them both to the ground, the floor beneath them splitting open to reveal the infinite void of space below. Thuron grabbed a protruding pipe, his legs dangling over the abyss, while Jorah caught herself on a door frame. With a grunt of exertion, Thuron pulled himself back onto solid ground, reaching out to help Jorah as she scrambled toward the airlock. The Vanguard was still there, its docking clamps strained to the breaking point as the derelict's rotation accelerated. They scrambled through the airlock, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them just as the station's primary structure began to implode. Thuron dove into the pilot's seat, his fingers dancing across the controls to disengage the clamps and fire the emergency thrusters. The Vanguard lurched away from the dying behemoth, the force of the acceleration pinning Thuron back into his seat. Behind them, the Obsidian station was swallowed by a blinding flash of white light as the Singularity core finally collapsed, creating a localized gravity well that sucked in everything within 1,000 kilometers. Thuron watched on the rear monitors as the wreckage of the ancient ship vanished into a single, infinitesimal point of light before disappearing entirely. The shockwave hit them a moment later, tossing the transport like a leaf in a storm, but Thuron held the course, his hands steady on the yoke. As the turbulence subsided and the stars returned to their steady, unblinking glow, Thuron slumped back in his seat, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. Jorah was sitting on the floor of the cockpit, her helmet removed, her face covered in sweat and grime. She looked at him and managed a weak, triumphant smile. In his lap, the crystalline energy cell continued to glow with its steady, unwavering white light. They had done it. They had survived the shroud and come away with a treasure that would change their lives forever. But as Thuron looked out at the vast, empty expanse of the outer reach, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something that should have remained buried. The energy cell was a beacon, and in the dark corners of the galaxy, there were things far more dangerous than sentinels that would see its light. He checked the navigation computer, setting a course for the nearest independent trading hub, but his mind was already miles away, wondering what other secrets were hidden in the obsidian glass of the forgotten. The journey was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The weight of the crystal in his hand felt like a promise and a curse all at once, a heavy reminder that in this universe, nothing of value was ever truly free. Thuron closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the Vanguard's engines soothe his frayed nerves. He thought about the carvings on the station walls, the way they seemed to tell a story of a civilization that had mastered gravity itself, only to be consumed by its own ambition. Was this cell a gift or a warning? He didn't know, and perhaps he never would. All that mattered now was getting back to civilization, finding a buyer who wouldn't ask too many questions, and disappearing before the ripples of their discovery reached the wrong ears. But as the ship transitioned into hyperspace, the streaks of starlight stretching out into infinite lines, Thuron felt a strange vibration through the floorboards, a low, rhythmic thrum that matched the heartbeat of the energy cell. It was as if the ship and the crystal were beginning to synchronize, a subtle harmony that hinted at a power far greater than anything he had ever imagined. He reached out and touched the console, feeling the warmth of the electronics, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of genuine hope. They were no longer just scavengers. They were the guardians of a lost fire, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The transition to hyperspace was always a disorienting experience, a blurring of reality where time and distance became fluid concepts. Theron watched the iridescent tunnels of the slipstream through the viewport, his thoughts drifting back to the derelict. He wondered if there were others like it, hidden in the lightless voids between stars, waiting for someone with enough desperation or foolishness to find them. He looked over at Jorah, who had fallen into a light sleep, her head resting against the bulkhead. She had always been the stronger of the two, the one who pushed them forward when the odds seemed insurmountable. He felt a surge of gratitude for her presence. Without her, he would have likely ended up as another ghost haunting the corridors of that obsidian tomb. He reached out and adjusted the climate control, the soft hiss of the vents filling the silence of the cabin. They were safe for now, but the galaxy was a vast and unforgiving place, and the secret they carried was a weight that would only grow heavier with time. He checked the status of the Vanguard, noting the various warnings and maintenance alerts that cluttered the display. The ship had taken a beating, and it would need a full overhaul once they reached port. But they had the resources now, or they would once they made the exchange. As the hours passed, Theron found himself unable to sleep. He kept returning to the energy cell, its light casting long, distorted shadows across the cockpit. It was so small, yet it contained enough power to run a city for a century. How had such a thing been created, and why had it been left behind? The questions swirled in his mind like the gases of the nebula they had just escaped. He began to run a diagnostic on the cell using the ship's limited sensor array, hoping to glean some insight into its composition. The results were baffling. The material was unlike anything in the known periodic table, a complex lattice of subatomic particles that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. It was a technological marvel, a piece of engineering that defied the standard models of physics. Theron felt a sense of awe mixed with a growing sense of dread. If this technology fell into the hands of the wrong people, the balance of power in the sector would be obliterated. He realized then that their plan to simply sell it to the highest bidder was dangerously naive. They were holding a catalyst for war, and every mercenary and warlord in the system would eventually come looking for it. He stood up and walked to the back of the cockpit, staring at the cell where it sat on the small dining table. Its light was soft, almost soothing, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He thought about the Sentinels, the way they had fought with a mindless, programmed ferocity. They weren't just protecting a power source, they were protecting a legacy. Theron felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. Had they stolen something that was meant to stay hidden, or had they saved it from a slow decay in the dark? He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. There was no room for philosophy in the life of a scavenger. Survival was the only metric that mattered. He went back to the pilot's seat and began to plan their next move. They couldn't go to a major hub. It was too risky. They needed somewhere quiet, somewhere off the beaten path where they could lie low and figure out their next move. He began to scan the star charts for a moon or an asteroid belt with a small, independent mining colony. A place like Oakhaven, perhaps, or the rings of Viridian. Somewhere they could disappear into the background noise of the galaxy. He finally settled on a small outpost called Zenith, a refueling station built into the side of a hollowed-out asteroid. It was a rough place, filled with smugglers and drifters, but it was far enough from the main trade routes to avoid unwanted attention. He punched in the coordinates and adjusted their exit vector, the Vanguard shifting slightly in the slipstream. He felt a sense of purpose now, a clarity that had been missing since they had first entered the shroud. They were on a new path, one that would lead them into the unknown, but for the first time in his life, Theron Vance felt like he was the one in control. He looked out at the streaking stars and felt a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. They had the cell, they had the ship, and they had each other. It was more than they had ever had before. The future was a blank slate, and he was ready to start writing. As the countdown to hyperspace exit began to tick down, he reached over and woke Jorah, her eyes snapping open with a start. He told her the plan, and she nodded, her expression grim but determined. They were ready for whatever came next. The orbit of obsidian glass was behind them, but the echoes of its power would follow them to the ends of the universe. The transition from the fluid, iridescent tunnel of hyperspace back into the harsh reality of real space felt like a physical blow to the chest. Theron Vance gripped the flight yokes as the vanguard of the void shuddered, the stars snapping back from elongated streaks into steady, biting points of light. Directly ahead loomed the fractured silhouette of the asteroid outpost Zenith, a jagged hunk of carbonaceous rock riddled with docking bays, glowing habitat bubbles, and the skeletal frames of half-disassembled freighters. It was a place where the laws of the central systems were whispered about as fairy tales, and where the only currency that truly mattered was functional technology or a fast trigger finger. Jorah Vane stood behind Theron, her hands resting on the back of his chair, her eyes narrowed as she studied the tactical overlay. The energy cells sat in a magnetic containment box on the floor between them, its white light muted by the reinforced plating, yet Theron could still feel the phantom hum of it vibrating through the soles of his boots. He keyed the short-range transmitter, broadcasting a scrambled identification code that marked them as a low-priority independent hauler seeking emergency repairs. The response was a burst of compressed data, a docking assignment for Bay 94, located in the lower, unshielded strata of the asteroid. It was exactly what he wanted, a spot far from the prying eyes of the station's customs officials, such as they were. Theron guided the transport into the shadow of the asteroid, the massive rock blocking out the distant glare of the system's primary star. The docking bay was a cavernous, poorly lit hollow that smelled of recycled oxygen, burnt lubricants, and the metallic tang of heavy industry. As the vanguard settled onto the hydraulic landing struts, the magnets engaged with a hollow clunk that echoed through the hull. Theron sat back, exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding since they left the shroud. He checked the internal chronometer. They had been running for nearly 20 hours straight, and the exhaustion was beginning to settle into his joints like lead. Jorah reached down and picked up the containment box, the weight of it causing her to shift her stance. She looked at Theron, her expression a mixture of wariness and resolve. They both knew that Zenith was a den of thieves, and walking around with a power source that could spark a planetary revolution was like carrying a lit torch through a fuel depot. They needed to find a contact, someone who could provide the specialized shielding they needed to mask the cell's unique signature before every bounty hunter in the quadrant picked up the scent. Theron stood up, stretching his cramped muscles, and grabbed his heavy duster from the locker. He checked his sidearm, ensuring the energy pack was seated firmly, and then motioned for Jorah to follow him toward the airlock. The station's interior was a labyrinth of pressurized tunnels and open-air markets carved directly into the stone. Gravity was inconsistent, provided by a series of aging centrifugal rings and localized plates that often fluctuated, giving Theron a constant sense of mild vertigo. They moved through the crowds of miners, engineers, and shadowed figures huddled in the corners of the concourse. No one looked twice at them. In a place like Zenith, everyone had a secret and a reason to keep their head down. Theron led the way toward a sub-level bar known as the Grotto, a place he had visited years ago during his time with the merchant guilds. It was run by a man named Vaxon, a former technician who had lost an arm in a plasma leak and had spent the rest of his life trading information instead of parts. Vaxon was a man who knew the resonance of every engine type in the sector and, more importantly, knew how to make things disappear. The bar was a dim, smoke-filled hole in the wall, illuminated by neon strips that hummed with an annoying, high-pitched frequency. Thuron spotted Vaxon behind the counter, his mechanical arm whirring softly as he polished a glass with a dirty rag. They took a seat in a secluded booth in the back, the high stone walls muffling the noise of the main floor. Vaxon approached them, his lone biological eye squinting in the low light as he recognized Thuron. He didn't offer a greeting, merely leaned over the table, his metallic fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern on the scarred wood. Thuron didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned in close, his voice a low whisper that barely carried across the table. He told Vaxon they had acquired a high-output power source that needed specialized dampeners, something that could hide a neutrino emission of significant magnitude. Vaxon's expression didn't change, but the tapping of his fingers stopped. He looked at the containment box Jorah was holding, then back at Thuron. He whispered that such a request was expensive and highly illegal, even by Zenith standards. He asked Thuron what kind of trouble they were bringing into his house. Thuron replied that it was the kind of trouble that paid well if handled correctly, but would incinerate everyone involved if the wrong people caught wind of it. Vaxon grunted, a sound of reluctant curiosity, and told them to wait while he made some calls. While Vaxon retreated to his back office, Thuron watched the entrance of the bar. Every person who walked through the door felt like a potential threat. He saw a pair of enforcers wearing the colors of a local mining syndicate, their eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference. He saw a group of scavengers arguing over a piece of salvage, their voices rising and falling in a harsh, guttural dialect. Jorah kept her hand on the containment box, her body coiled like a spring. She whispered to Thuron that she didn't like being stationary, that the longer they stayed in one place, the easier it was for someone to track their trajectory from the shroud. Thuron agreed, but they had no choice. Without the dampeners, the Vanguard was a glowing target on every long-range scanner in the sector. They needed to move, but they needed to be invisible first. The wait felt like hours, the tension in the booth growing thick enough to choke on. Finally, Vaxon emerged from the back, beckoning them toward a private room behind the bar. Inside the small, cluttered workshop, Vaxon gestured for Jorah to place the box on a lead-lined workbench. He pulled out a handheld scanner and ran it over the exterior of the container. The device immediately began to scream, its display overloading with data points that the old technician had clearly never seen before. Vaxon's eyes widened and he stepped back, his mechanical hand twitching. He looked at Thuron, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. He asked where in the void they had found such a thing, stating that the energy readings were off the charts, suggesting a core density that shouldn't be possible in a handheld unit. Thuron told him it didn't matter where it came from, only that it needed to be hidden. Vaxon nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the technical requirements. He explained that a standard lead casing wouldn't be enough. They needed a phase-shifting shroud, a device that could bleed the excess radiation into a pocket of subspace. He happened to have a prototype that he had scavenged from a decommissioned research vessel, but it would take time to calibrate it to the cell's specific frequency. As Vaxon began to work, his mechanical fingers moving with surprising delicacy, a sudden explosion rocked the station. The floor buckled, and the lights in the workshop flickered and died, replaced by the red strobe of the emergency alarms. Thuron was on his feet in an instant, his pistol drawn. Through the thin walls of the workshop, he could hear the sound of shouting and the unmistakable crackle of pulse fire. Someone had found them. Vaxon cursed, scrambling to secure the energy cell into the unfinished shroud. He told them that the station's security had been breached, and that a heavy-duty boarding party was cutting through the docking bay doors. Thuron realized with a sickening jolt that they hadn't been followed from the shroud, they had been betrayed. Someone on Zenith had picked up their arrival and sold the information to the highest bidder. He grabbed Jorah's arm, pulling her toward a secondary exit that led into the maintenance shafts. They couldn't go back through the bar, it would be a kill zone. They scrambled through the dark, narrow tunnels, the air thick with the smell of smoke and burning insulation. The sounds of combat were getting louder, the vibration of the explosions echoing through the rock of the asteroid. Thuron led the way, his lamp cutting a narrow path through the gloom. He knew the layout of Zenith well enough to know that these shafts eventually led to the cargo elevators near the lower docking bays. If they could reach the Vanguard, they might still have a chance to break for open space. Behind them, he heard the heavy thud of boots and the metallic clatter of equipment. The pursuers were close, and they were moving with a precision that suggested professional mercenaries, not local thugs. Jorah turned and fired a blind burst behind them, the blue light of her rifle illuminating a group of armored figures rounding a corner. They were wearing matte black environmental suits with no markings, their faces hidden behind dark visors. These were professionals, likely hired by one of the shadow corporations that operated on the fringes of the galaxy. The chase moved into a wide industrial corridor used for transporting heavy ore. Thuron and Jorah ducked behind a massive mining drill, using it for cover as the mercenaries opened fire. The air was filled with the whine of ricocheting bolts and the scream of tearing metal. Thuron returned fire, his kinetic pistol punching holes in the thin bulkheads, but the attackers were using advanced portable shields that absorbed the impact of his shots. He realized they were being pinned down, trapped in a bottleneck, while more mercenaries moved to flank them. He looked at Jorah, who was frantically checking her rifle's power levels. She told him they were running out of time and ammunition. Thuron scanned the room, his eyes lighting on a series of pressurized gas canisters lined up against the far wall. They were marked with volatile warnings, used for the high-temperature cutting torches on the assembly line. He told Jorah to cover him, and then he made a desperate dash toward the canisters. The mercenaries shifted their fire toward him, the bolts narrowly missing his heels as he dove behind the metal crates. He aimed his pistol at the valves of the primary tank and fired 3 rapid shots. The tank ruptured with a deafening roar, releasing a massive cloud of superheated gas that expanded instantly into the corridor. The explosion was followed by a secondary blast as the other canisters ignited, creating a wall of fire and debris that cut off the mercenaries' line of sight. Thuron used the chaos to scramble back to Jorah, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the cargo elevator. They dove inside just as the doors began to hiss shut, the heat from the explosion singeing the back of Thuron's duster. The elevator descended rapidly, the floor vibrating under the strain of the descent. Thuron leaned against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He looked at the containment box in Jorah's arms. It was scorched and dented, but the light of the energy cell still pulsed within. They were alive, but the station was crawling with people who wanted them dead. As the elevator reached the lower docking level, the doors slid open to reveal a scene of absolute carnage. The docking bay was a war zone, with the station's ragtag security force locked in a desperate struggle against the black-clad invaders. The Vanguard was still there, but a squad of mercenaries was already setting up a perimeter around the ship. Thuron knew they couldn't just walk up to the boarding ramp. They needed a distraction, something big enough to pull the mercenaries away from the transport. He spotted a heavy cargo hauler parked on a nearby mag track, its bed loaded with massive crates of refined ore. If he could jumpstart the hauler and send it careening toward the mercenary line, It might give them the opening they needed. He told Jorah to stay in the shadows and wait for his signal. He moved low and fast, weaving through the crates and machinery until he reached the hauler's cockpit. The controls were ancient and sluggish, but the engine roared to life after a few frantic attempts. Theron slammed the throttle forward and jumped from the cab just as the massive vehicle lunged forward on its tracks. The hauler gained speed with terrifying momentum, its sheer mass making it an unstoppable force in the narrow docking bay. The mercenaries saw it coming and tried to disable it with their rifles, but the heavy plating of the ore carrier shrugged off the fire. The hauler slammed into the mercenary perimeter with the force of a falling moon, scattering the attackers and creating a massive pileup of metal and fire. Theron screamed for Jorah to run, and they both bolted toward the vanguard. They scrambled up the boarding ramp just as the mercenaries began to regroup. Theron dove into the pilot's seat and slammed his hand against the emergency launch sequence. The docking clamps blew apart with a series of controlled charges, and the Vanguard's engines roared to life, the ship leaping away from the asteroid with a violent jerk. Theron didn't wait to check the scanners. He pushed the engines to their absolute limit, the ship groaning as it accelerated through the debris field surrounding Zenith. Behind them, he could see the flares of pursuit craft launching from the station's hangars, their engines glowing like angry eyes in the dark. He pushed the ship through a series of tight maneuvers, using the surrounding asteroids as cover to break the line of sight. The Vanguard was agile, but it wasn't built for a high-speed dogfight against dedicated interceptors. Theron could hear the proximity alarms wailing as the first wave of missiles was launched. He deployed a cloud of chaff and flares, the explosions rocking the ship as the missiles detonated harmlessly in their wake. He needed to get them to the jump point, but the mercenaries were closing the gap. He looked at Jorah, who was sitting in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers flying across the electronic warfare console. She told him she was trying to jam their targeting computers, but the mercenary tech was too advanced. They needed more power. Theron looked down at the containment box. The energy cell was sitting there, an untapped well of infinite potential. He realized that if he could bypass the ship's primary power couplings and feed the cell's output directly into the engines, they could achieve a level of thrust that would leave the interceptors in the dust. It was a suicidal idea. The ship's systems weren't designed to handle that kind of load, and the whole thing could vaporize in an instant. But as he looked at the growing number of red icons on the radar, he knew they had no other choice. He told Jorah to get the bypass cables from the floor panel. She looked at him like he was insane, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as he did that they were out of options. With shaking hands, Jorah connected the heavy-duty cables to the energy cell's output terminals. Theron watched the power gauges on his console. As soon as the connection was made, the needles buried themselves in the red. The entire ship began to vibrate with a high-pitched hum that set Theron's teeth on edge. The lights in the cockpit flared to a blinding brilliance, and the engine monitors showed a power spike that defied the ship's theoretical limits. Theron gripped the yokes, his heart pounding against his ribs. He told Jorah to hang on, and then he opened the throttles. The Vanguard didn't just accelerate, it vanished. The force of the movement pinned them into their seats with several times the normal force of gravity, the stars outside turning into a blurred smear of white light. The interceptors behind them simply disappeared from the scanners, unable to match even a fraction of the speed. They were moving faster than the ship's computer could calculate, the hull screaming under the incredible stress of the pseudo-velocity. Theron struggled to keep the ship straight, his vision narrowing as the G-force threatened to black him out. He knew they couldn't maintain this for long. The engines were already starting to melt, and the structural integrity of the hull was failing. He needed to drop them back into normal space before the ship tore itself apart. He reached for the power cutoff, his fingers fumbling with the switch. With a violent jerk, he pulled the cables free from the cell. The sudden loss of thrust was almost as violent as the acceleration, the ship tumbling through space as it bled off the excess momentum. Theron fought the controls, eventually bringing the Vanguard back into a stable drift. The cockpit was silent, save for the sound of sparks jumping between the scorched cables and the heavy breathing of the two pilots. Theron looked out the viewport. They were in a completely different sector of space, thousands of light years from Zenith. He checked the navigation computer, but the screen was a jumble of static and error messages. He had no idea where they were, but they were safe. The mercenaries were gone, and the energy cell was still sitting in its box, seemingly unaffected by the massive power draw. Theron looked at Jorah, who was staring at the cell with an expression of pure terror. She whispered that they had just done something that shouldn't be possible. Theron nodded, his mind reeling from the implications. They had a weapon in their hands, or a god, and they had no idea how to control it. The journey had just become infinitely more dangerous, and the galaxy was starting to feel very small. The interior of the Vanguard of the Void felt like the inside of a dying lung, the air thin and metallic, circulating with a sluggishness that suggested the primary life support systems were on the verge of total collapse. Theron Vance wiped a smear of cooling fluid from his forehead, his eyes fixed on the flickering diagnostic screen that detailed the extensive damage to the ship's internal architecture. The temporary surge of energy from the crystalline cell had effectively cauterized half of the ship's secondary relays, leaving them drifting in a pocket of space that didn't appear on any of the standard merchant charts. Outside the viewport, the stars were crowded and vibrant, clustered into dense, swirling nurseries of gas and dust that suggested they were deep within a stellar nebula far beyond the charted territories of the outer reach. Theron glanced back at Jorah, who was kneeling by the energy cell, her hands hovering over the containment box as if she expected it to explode at any moment. She looked up at him, her face pale under the flickering amber emergency lights, and remarked that the ship was essentially a floating coffin unless they could find a way to patch the primary power bus. Theron nodded, knowing she was right, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the strange, rhythmic pulsing that was now emanating from the cell itself. It was no longer a steady glow. It was a heartbeat, a slow and deliberate thrum that seemed to be communicating with the ship's remaining sensors in a language they couldn't translate. Theron moved to the aft engineering crawl space, his joints aching from the sheer physical toll of the escape. He pulled away a charred panel to reveal a nest of melted copper and fused fiber optics, the remnants of the bypass Jorah had rigged during the flight from Zenith. The smell of ozone was thick enough to taste, and he had to use a handheld torch to cut through the slagged remains of the power couplings. He began the painstaking process of rerouting the auxiliary batteries to the life support and short-range comms, his fingers moving with a mechanical precision born of years of survival. As he worked, he could hear the ship groaning, the hull plates expanding and contracting as they shed the heat from the high-velocity run. He thought about the mercenaries back at the asteroid and the efficiency with which they had been hunted. This wasn't just a corporate retrieval op. Someone high up in the orbital hierarchies knew exactly what this cell was and what it was capable of doing. He realized they were no longer just scavengers who had stumbled onto a lucky find. They were fugitives holding a piece of technology that could shift the entire paradigm of interstellar travel. After an hour of frantic repairs, the lights in the cockpit stabilized, and the low hum of the oxygen scrubbers returned to a functional level. Theron climbed back into the pilot's seat, his hands resting on the cold metal of the console. He began a long-range scan of their surroundings, hoping to find a celestial landmark or a known pulsar to fix their position. The screen flickered to life, displaying a chaotic tapestry of gravitational anomalies and high-density matter. They were in a region of space known in ancient myths as the Grave of the Forerunners, a sector so densely packed with black holes and volatile stars that it had remained untouched by the expansion of the modern starfaring nations. If they were truly here, it meant the energy cell had pushed the ship through a localized fold in space-time, a feat that defied every known law of physics. Jorah joined him at the console, her eyes scanning the data with a mixture of dread and fascination. She pointed to a massive, dark mass at the center of the nebula, a shadow that seemed to be exerting a powerful pull on the surrounding gas. It wasn't a star or a black hole. It was something artificial, a structure of such immense proportions that it distorted the light around it like a lens. As they drifted closer to the anomaly, the energy cell in the containment box began to react, its pulses quickening until the white light became a steady, blinding glare. The Vanguard began to accelerate, not through the use of its thrusters, but as if it were being pulled by an invisible tether toward the dark structure. Thuron tried to engage the reverse engines, but the controls were unresponsive, the ship's computer locked into a docking sequence that he hadn't initiated. The dark mass began to resolve into a terrifyingly familiar shape. It was another obsidian station, identical in design to the one they had discovered in the shroud, but this one was intact, its crystalline veins glowing with a vibrant, emerald light. It was a cathedral of glass and shadow, a silent sentinel waiting in the heart of the nebula. Thuron felt a sense of inevitability wash over him. The cell wasn't just a power source. It was a key, and it was taking them back to its origin point. The Vanguard was pulled into a massive hangar bay that opened like the mouth of a gargantuan beast. Inside, the walls were lined with rows of derelict ships, some of designs Thuron recognized from history books, others so alien they defied description. It was a graveyard of those who had found the cells before them, a collection of explorers who had been lured into the trap and never found their way out. The docking clamps engaged with a soft, magnetic click, and the silence that followed was absolute. Thuron and Jorah sat in the cockpit, staring out at the rows of dead ships. They knew that staying on the Vanguard was a slow death, but stepping out into the station felt like a finality they weren't ready to face. Thuron reached for his rifle, checking the charge one last time. He looked at Jorah and told her that if they were going to die, they might as well see what was at the center of the maze. She nodded, her jaw set in a hard line, and together they stepped through the airlock and into the emerald glow of the obsidian station. The air inside the station was surprisingly fresh, lacking the recycled tang of the Vanguard. It felt like a mountain breeze, cold and clean, with a hint of something floral that Thuron couldn't identify. The hangar was vast, the ceiling lost in a haze of green light, and the floor was made of the same translucent obsidian they had seen before. They moved cautiously through the rows of ships, their boots making no sound on the smooth surface. Thuron noticed that many of the vessels appeared perfectly preserved, as if their crews had simply walked away and never returned. There were no signs of struggle, no battle damage, just a haunting sense of abandonment. As they reached the far end of the hangar, a set of massive doors slid open, revealing a wide corridor that led toward the center of the station. The walls were covered in the same geometric carvings they had seen in the shroud, but here they were moving, the symbols shifting and rearranging themselves in a mesmerizing dance of information. Thuron followed the flow of the symbols, sensing that they were being guided. They passed through chambers filled with strange machinery, tall, spindly towers that hummed with a low frequency, and pools of liquid silver that rippled without a breeze. In the center of the station, they found the Great Hall, a chamber so large it had its own weather patterns, with thin clouds drifting below a ceiling that mimicked the night sky of a world Thuron didn't recognize. At the center of the hall stood a pedestal, and sitting upon it was a figure. It was humanoid, but its skin was made of the same shifting obsidian as the walls, and its eyes were two glowing points of emerald light. It didn't move as they approached, but Thuron could feel a presence in his mind, a cold, vast intelligence that was observing them with the detachment of a scientist looking at a specimen. The figure spoke, though not through sound. The words appeared in Thuron's mind, clear and resonant. It identified itself as a guardian, a remnant of a civilization that had long ago transcended the need for physical form, leaving behind these stations as repositories of their knowledge and power. It explained that the energy cells were not meant to be found by those who still lived in the shadow of war and greed. They were tests, beacons designed to find those with the potential to join the great transcendence. Thuron felt a surge of anger. He thought of the mercenaries, the people who had died on Zenith, and the desperation that had driven him and Jorah to this point. He told the Guardian that they hadn't come for transcendence, they had come for survival. The Guardian tilted its head, the movement fluid and unsettling. It stated that survival was a base instinct, but the power they carried in the containment box was the spark of creation itself. The Guardian offered them a choice. They could leave the cell and remain in the station as students of the ancient knowledge, or they could take the cell and return to their own space, knowing that the light of the crystal would act as a beacon for every predator in the galaxy. Jorah looked at the cell and then at the Guardian. She asked what would happen to the galaxy if the technology was released. The Guardian's eyes flickered. It replied that the galaxy would either burn in the fire of its own ambition or rise to a new era of enlightenment, and that the choice was not for the Guardians to make, but for those who carried the spark. Thuron looked at the rows of dead ships in the hangar and realized the truth. The other explorers hadn't been trapped. They had chosen to stay. They had seen the truth of the universe and decided that the struggle of their previous lives was no longer worth the effort. Thuron felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked at Jorah, seeing the same conflict mirrored in her eyes. They were tired of running, tired of being the small fish in a vast, uncaring pond. The promise of knowledge and safety was a powerful lure. But then he thought of the Vanguard, with its dented hull and its recycled air, and he realized he wasn't ready to give up on the world he knew, no matter how broken it was. He told the Guardian that they would take the cell. They weren't ready to be ghosts in a museum. The Guardian didn't seem disappointed. If anything, there was a ripple of something like respect in its emerald gaze. It stood up, the obsidian of its body flowing like water, and gestured toward the hall's exit. It told them that the path back was open, but warned them that the shadows were growing longer. As they walked back toward the hangar, the station began to vibrate, a deep, resonant tone that felt like a farewell. They boarded the Vanguard, and Thuron found that the ship systems had been miraculously restored, the scorched panels replaced with seamless obsidian plating that hummed with a quiet power. The energy cell was back in its box, but its light was now a calm, steady gold. As they cleared the hangar and moved back into the nebula, Thuron looked at the navigation console. A new set of coordinates had been programmed into the computer, leading toward a sector of space he had never heard of, a place called the Cradle. He didn't know what was waiting for them there, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. He engaged the engines, and the Vanguard surged forward, moving with a grace and speed it had never possessed before. They were no longer just scavengers, they were the messengers of a forgotten age, and the journey was only just beginning. The Vanguard of the Void no longer felt like the rattling bucket of bolts Thuron Vance had spent his life repairing. The obsidian plating integrated into the hull by the Guardian station had hushed the ship's perpetual groans, replacing them with a low, melodic vibration that seemed to harmonize with the very fabric of space. As they transitioned into the jump toward the coordinates known as the cradle, the stars did not smear into the usual white lines. Instead, they became a kaleidoscope of amber and violet, as if the ship was sliding through the layers of a cosmic pearl. Thuron sat at the helm, his hands resting lightly on the new, glass-like controls that had grown out of the old console. He felt a strange, telepathic link with the vessel now, a sense that the ship was aware of his intent before he even moved a finger. Beside him, Jorah Vane was preoccupied with the energy cell, which had transitioned from a volatile white glare to a deep, rhythmic gold. She noted that the radiation levels were now non-existent, despite the massive output recorded by the sensors. It was as if the cell had finally stabilized, or perhaps it had simply accepted them as its carriers. They were deep in the uncharted territories of the galactic core, a region where the density of stars was so great that the night sky through the viewport was a solid wall of brilliance. The journey to the cradle took what felt like an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. Time within the modified Vanguard had become elastic, influenced by the proximity of the energy cell and the ancient technology woven into the bulkheads. Thuron spent hours staring into the gold light of the crystal, seeing visions of a civilization that had built cities around the hearts of stars and woven the threads of gravity into a tapestry of transit. He saw the fall of that civilization, not through war or disaster, but through a collective decision to move beyond the physical plane, leaving their tools behind as a legacy for whoever had the courage to find them. He realized that the dominion of the current galactic powers, the corporations, the warlords, the planetary syndicates, was nothing more than children playing with sticks in the shadow of a mountain. When the ship finally dropped out of the slipstream, they were greeted by a sight that defied every astronomical model Thuron had ever studied. The cradle was not a planet, but a massive Dyson shell constructed around a binary star system, a sphere of articulated plates and glowing conduits that spanned millions of kilometers. As they approached the structure, a voice that was not a voice echoed through the cockpit, a welcoming resonance that bypassed their ears and spoke directly to their consciousness. It identified itself as the archive, the collective memory of the ones who had built the obsidian stations. It guided the Vanguard toward an aperture in the shell, a triangular opening that led into an internal world of breathtaking complexity. Inside the shell, gravity was maintained by the rotation of the plates, creating a landscape of hanging gardens, floating cities, and rivers of liquid light that flowed through the air like ribbons. There was no sun in the traditional sense. The light came from the binary stars at the center, filtered through a series of translucent membranes that created a soft, eternal twilight. Thuron steered the ship toward a landing platform that jutted out from a spire of white stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the heart of the mystery, the place where the energy cell was meant to be returned. They stepped out onto the platform, the air here smelling of rain and ancient ozone. There were no guards, no sentinels to meet them, only the vast, echoing silence of a world that had been waiting for a visitor for 10,000 years. Jorah carried the containment box with a reverence that bordered on the religious, her eyes darting across the horizon as if expecting the builders to materialize from the shadows. They moved toward the central spire, the obsidian symbols on their suits and ship glowing in response to the proximity of the archive. As they entered the spire's base, the walls dissolved into holographic displays of the galaxy's history, showing the rise and fall of countless species, all of them connected by the search for the energy cells. Thuron realized that they were not the first to reach the cradle, but they were the first in an age. The other ships he had seen in the Obsidian Station had belonged to those who had failed the final test, those who had sought to use the power for themselves rather than return it to the source. At the center of the spire lay a vast, circular chamber filled with thousands of empty slots, each designed to hold an energy cell. Thuron understood then the magnitude of their task. The cells were the batteries of the archive, the scattered pieces of a galactic neural network that had been deactivated to prevent its misuse. By returning their cell, they were reconnecting a single nerve ending in a giant that had been asleep for eons. Jorah stepped forward, her hands trembling as she opened the containment box. The gold light of the cell filled the chamber, reflecting off the polished white walls. She looked at Thuron, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, knowing that there was no going back. This was the purpose they had been chosen for, the reason they had survived the shroud and the treachery of Zenith. With a steady breath, Jorah placed the cell into the nearest slot. The reaction was instantaneous. A pulse of golden energy rippled out from the cell, surging through the conduits of the spire and spreading across the entire Dyson shell. The internal world of the cradle flared to life, the hanging gardens blooming with bioluminescent flowers and the floating cities humming with renewed power. The archive's voice returned, stronger and more vibrant than before, thanking them for the restoration of the first node. But the celebration was short-lived. On the Vanguard's remote sensors, which were still linked to Thuron's neural interface, a fleet of ships appeared at the aperture of the Dyson shell. They were not the sleek, elegant vessels of the builders. They were the jagged, brutal warships of the Black Sun Syndicate, the very mercenaries who had hunted them at Zenith. They had followed the trail of the energy cell's unique signature, and they had brought a small army with them. Thuron cursed, realizing that the activation of the node had acted as a flare, lighting up their position for anyone with a long-range scanner. The Syndicate didn't care about the history of the archive or the sanctity of the cradle. They only saw a source of infinite power and a structure they could strip for parts. The aperture was closing, but not fast enough to stop the first wave of boarding craft from entering the shell. Thuron and Jorah were trapped in the spire, miles away from their ship, with a mercenary army descending upon them. The archive spoke again, its tone shifting from gratitude to a cold, calculated pragmatism. It stated that the defense systems of the cradle had not been fully restored, and that the intruders posed a direct threat to the integrity of the first node. It offered Thuron and Jorah a final choice. They could remain in the spire and watch as the archive was dismantled, or they could accept a temporary infusion of the cell's power to defend the heart of the galaxy. Thuron didn't hesitate. He felt a surge of heat as the archive channeled energy directly into his environmental suit, the fabric hardening into a shimmering suit of golden armor. Jorah underwent the same transformation, her pulse rifle glowing with a condensed white flame that made her previous weapon look like a toy. They were no longer scavengers. They were the avatars of a dead civilization, tasked with protecting its last remaining light. As the first mercenary drop pods slammed into the base of the spire, Thuron and Jorah stepped out to meet them. The air was filled with the roar of engines and the scream of tearing metal, but Thuron felt a strange sense of calm. He raised his hand, and a wave of kinetic energy shattered the lead pod, sending the mercenaries sprawling across the white stone. The battle for the cradle had begun, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of the stars. The mercenaries were well equipped, but they were fundamentally unprepared for the power Thuron and Jorah now wielded. Each bolt from Jorah's rifle didn't just strike a target. It detonated with the force of a small star, vaporizing the heavy shields and armored plates of the Syndicate soldiers. Thuron moved with a speed that defied the laws of motion, his every strike backed by the gravitational force of the archive itself. He could feel the connection to the Dyson shell, the way the plates shifted beneath his feet to provide him with the perfect vantage point. Yet for every mercenary they struck down, 10 more seemed to emerge from the darkness of the hangar. The Syndicate commander, a man known only as Vayek, landed his command ship directly on the platform where the Vanguard was moored. He was a mountain of a man, encased in a massive exosuit that hummed with stolen technology. Vayek's voice boomed over the localized comms, mocking Thuron for thinking he could protect a graveyard. He ordered his men to focus their fire on the spire's structural supports, intending to bring the entire archive crashing down if he couldn't control it. Thuron saw the danger immediately. The spire was the focal point of the shell's stability. If it fell, the binary stars at the center would lose their containment, and the entire Dyson system would collapse into a supernova. He looked at Jorah, who was currently pinned down by a squad of snipers. He told her to hold the entrance to the inner chamber at all costs, while he went to deal with Vayek. He didn't wait for a response, launching himself into the air and using the gravitational fields to glide toward the landing platform. The confrontation with Vayek was a clash of two different eras. Vayek represented the raw, destructive greed of the current age, while Thuron was the champion of a forgotten wisdom. The exosuit swung a massive hydraulic fist that would have crushed a normal man, but Thuron caught the blow in a field of golden energy. The shockwave of the impact cracked the white stone of the platform and sent a tremor through the Vanguard. Thuron pushed back, his eyes glowing with the same gold light as the energy cell. He told Vayek that some things were not meant to be owned. Vayek laughed, a harsh metallic sound, and unleashed a barrage of micro-missiles from his shoulder launchers. Thuron danced through the explosions, his movements a blur of gold and shadow, closing the distance until he was face to face with the mercenary leader. He reached out and grabbed the chest plate of Vayek's suit, feeling the archive's power surging through his arms. He didn't use a weapon, he simply willed the energy to overload the suit's power core. The stolen technology within the exosuit screamed in protest as it was flooded with a frequency it was never meant to handle. With a blinding flash, the suit systems fried, locking Vayek inside a tomb of dead metal. Thuron kicked the paralyzed suit off the platform, watching as it plummeted into the abyss of the Dyson shell's interior. With their leader gone, the remaining mercenaries began to falter, their morale breaking in the face of the supernatural defense. The archive took control of the localized weather patterns, summoning a massive storm of ionizing gas that swept the landing platforms clean of the remaining invaders. As the last of the Syndicate ships fled back through the aperture, the Dyson shell finally completed its seal. The silence returned to the cradle, but it was no longer a silence of death. It was a silence of preparation. Thuron and Jorah stood on the platform, their golden armor fading back into their worn environmental suits. They were exhausted, battered, and changed forever. The archive's voice spoke one last time, informing them that the first node was stable, but that there were thousands more across the galaxy that needed to be found and returned. The journey they had started in the Shroud was merely the first step in a grand restoration. Thuron looked at the Vanguard, then at the sprawling internal world of the Cradle. He knew they couldn't stay here. They were the only ones who knew the truth and the only ones who could find the other cells. He looked at Jorah, who was already heading back to the ship, a tired but determined smile on her face. They had a long way to go, and the galaxy was still a dangerous place, but for the first time in history, the stars had a reason to hope. The Vanguard of the Void drifted through the silent, lightless expanse of the Great Rift, a massive corridor of empty space that separated the core systems from the outer spiral arms. The ship's exterior was no longer a dull, battered grey. The obsidian veins infused into its hull pulsed with a rhythmic golden light, as if the vessel itself had become a living extension of the archive. Theron Vance sat in the pilot's chair, his mind tethered to the ship's new consciousness. He could feel the proximity of the next energy cell, a faint but persistent resonance that pulled at his senses from a system hidden within a cluster of collapsing white dwarfs. Beside him, Jorah Vane was reviewing the data logs provided by the cradle, her face illuminated by the soft amber glow of the terminal. She noted that the next node was located on a world the ancients had called Oros, a planet that had been subjected to such intense gravitational forces that its surface was a shifting mosaic of crystalline mountains and rivers of molten glass. They were no longer simply running for their lives. They were the architects of a reconstruction, following a trail of breadcrumbs left by a civilization that had mastered the soul of the universe. The transition into the Oros system was violent, the ship buffeted by the intense magnetic fields of the dying stars, but the obsidian plating held firm, absorbing the radiation and converting it into thrust. As they descended through the atmospheric layers of Oros, the sky transitioned from a bruised purple to a searing, translucent gold. The landscape below was a nightmare of geological instability, with jagged spires of quartz jutting thousands of meters into the air, reflecting the harsh light of the white dwarfs in a blinding display of optics. Theron guided the vanguard toward a sheltered canyon where the archive had indicated the presence of the second node. The landing was a delicate dance between the ship's thrusters and the planet's erratic gravity wells, the floor of the cockpit tilting at impossible angles as the landing struts searched for solid ground. When the engines finally cycled down, the silence that followed was heavy with the sound of the planet's internal grinding, the groans of tectonic plates shifting under the weight of the stellar neighbors. Theron and Jorah prepared for the excursion, their environmental suits now reinforced with the same golden filaments they had worn during the battle at the cradle. They knew that Oros was not just a geological hazard. It was a sanctuary for the remnants of the automated defense systems that had survived the passage of eons. The journey into the depths of the crystalline canyon was a test of physical and mental endurance. The air outside was thin and filled with microscopic shards of glass that pinged against their visors like rain. Theron led the way, his handheld scanner emitting a steady chime as they drew closer to the node's signature. They moved through tunnels of translucent stone, the light from their shoulder lamps refracting into 1,000 rainbows that danced across the walls. Jorah kept her rifle at the ready, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the crystalline sentinels that were said to haunt this world. She whispered that the planet felt alive, as if the rocks themselves were watching their progress with a cold, mineral curiosity. As they reached a vast subterranean vault, the source of the signal became clear. Suspended in the center of the chamber was a massive pillar of obsidian, identical to the one in the shroud, but this one was surrounded by a ring of floating, geometric shapes that rotated in a complex, interlocking pattern. This was the second node, the heartbeat of the Oros system, and it was guarded by a collective of constructs that looked like shards of broken glass held together by threads of static electricity. The constructs did not attack immediately. They drifted in the air, their surfaces reflecting Theron's image in a distorted, haunting hall of mirrors. The archive's voice spoke in Theron's mind, explaining that these were the echoes, the recorded imprints of the people who had once lived on Oros. They were not alive in the biological sense, but they were the keepers of the system's memory, tasked with ensuring that only those who understood the price of power could claim the energy cell. To take the cell, Thuron and Jorah would have to undergo the trial of reflection, a process that would force them to confront the choices they had made and the motivations that drove them into the dark. Thuron felt a sudden, sharp pain in his temples as the chamber began to shift, the walls dissolving into a series of vivid, holographic memories. He saw his childhood on the mining colonies, the hunger and the fear that had defined his early years, and the moment he had decided to leave it all behind for a life of scavenging. He saw the faces of the people he had outrun and the partners he had lost to the void, their eyes filled with a silent, accusing reproach. Beside him, Jorah was experiencing her own trial, her body trembling as she stood frozen in a memory of the war that had decimated her home system. She saw the decisions she had made in the heat of combat, the lives she had sacrificed to ensure her own survival, and the cold, hollow core of her ambition. The echoes moved closer, their shimmering forms vibrating with a high-pitched hum that resonated with the frequency of their guilt. Thuron realized that the trial wasn't about being perfect, it was about honesty. He reached out into the holographic storm, acknowledging the weight of his past and the selfishness that had led him to the shroud. He spoke to the shadows, telling them that he no longer sought the power for himself, but for the restoration of the light that could save others from the same cycle of desperation. The golden light in his suit flared, pushing back the darkness of the memories, and he felt a sudden, profound sense of release. Jorah, too, seemed to find her center, her rifle lowering as she accepted the reality of her scars. The echoes began to merge, their fragmented shapes coming together to form a single, towering figure of translucent light. It bowed its head in a gesture of recognition, and the rotating ring around the obsidian pillar slowed to a halt. The second node was now accessible. Thuron stepped forward and placed his hand on the pillar, feeling a surge of energy that was both terrifying and comforting. The energy cell within the pillar didn't need to be removed. Instead, it transferred its essence directly into the containment box Jorah was holding. The chamber was flooded with a vibrant violet light, and the planet itself seemed to exhale, the grinding of the tectonic plates softening into a steady, rhythmic hum. They had secured the second piece of the puzzle, but the archive warned them that the activation of the Oros node had been noticed. The Black Sun Syndicate was not the only power interested in the return of the Ancients. A new signature had appeared on the long-range sensors, a fleet of ships from the Core Authority, the very government Thuron had spent his life avoiding. The Core Authority represented order, but it was an order built on the suppression of any technology they couldn't control. They viewed the archive not as a legacy to be restored, but as a threat to their hegemony. As Thuron and Jorah scrambled back to the Vanguard, they could see the atmospheric fire of the Authority's descent craft. These weren't mercenaries, these were disciplined soldiers with the full weight of a galactic empire behind them. Thuron pushed the Vanguard's engines to their limit, the obsidian hull shimmering as it fought the planet's gravity. They broke through the clouds just as the Authority's capital ship, a massive, wedge-shaped dreadnought, moved into orbit above them. The dreadnought's tractor beams reached out like invisible fingers, trying to snag the smaller transport, but the energy from the Oros node provided the Vanguard with a localized gravity shield that deflected the beams. The escape from Oros was a frantic game of cat and mouse through the rings of the white dwarfs. Thuron used the intense magnetic interference of the dying stars to mask their signature, diving into the heart of the radiation belts where the Authority's ships couldn't follow. He felt the ship responding to his every thought, the obsidian plating vibrating with the energy of the two nodes. They were faster and more elusive than anything the Authority possessed, but they were also marked men. There was nowhere in the known galaxy they could hide now. Jorah sat at the tactical console, her expression grim as she watched the icons of the pursuing fleet. She asked Thuron where they were going next. He looked at the navigation display, where a third coordinate had appeared, a system on the very edge of the galactic void, a place where the stars were so sparse that it was known as the Great Silence. Thuron told her that they were going to the end of the world. The third node was located on a station called the Solstice, a structure that had been built to monitor the expansion of the universe itself. It was there that the final piece of the activation sequence would be found. As the Vanguard prepared to jump into the void, Thuron looked back at the fading light of Oros. He felt a sense of heavy responsibility. They were no longer just two people trying to make a living. They were the guardians of a fire that could either light the way to a new future or burn the galaxy to a cinder. He engaged the jump drive, and the stars once again became a blur of violet and gold. The journey was entering its final phase, and the shadows were closing in from every side. The core authority would not stop until they had the cells, and the syndicate was still lurking in the darkness, waiting for a moment of weakness. Thuron gripped the controls, his resolve hardening. They had come too far to fail now. The orbit of obsidian glass was a path they had to follow to its conclusion, no matter what waited for them in the silence of the void. The Great Silence was not merely a name for the void at the galaxy's edge. It was a physical weight that pressed against the hull of the vanguard of the void. Out here, the density of matter was so low that the cosmic background radiation felt like a lonely whisper against the ship's sensors. Thuron Vance stared into the absolute blackness of the intergalactic gulf, where the stars of the Milky Way were reduced to a distant, glowing smudge behind them. The ship's obsidian veins were now a deep, pulsing violet, synchronized with the two energy cells secured in the hold. Ahead, solitary and defiant against the nothingness, sat the Solstice. It was a station of impossible geometry, a ring of floating monoliths that rotated around a central core of pure, stabilized vacuum. It looked less like a machine and more like a frozen explosion of glass and light. Thuron could feel the pull of the final node, a gravitational resonance so precise it felt like a needle threading through his mind. Beside him, Jorah Vane was silent, her hands clasped in her lap. She had stopped checking the sensors. She knew as well as he did that the core authority and the remnants of the Black Sun Syndicate would be converging on this final point. This was the terminus, the place where the legacy of the ancients would either be reborn or extinguished forever. As the Vanguard approached the rotating monoliths, the ship systems began to merge with the station's local network. The glass-like controls on the console flowed and shifted, forming a three-dimensional map of the Solstice's interior. The final node was not a physical object like the others. It was a state of being, a frequency that needed to be harmonized within the station's core to ignite the galactic network. Thuron guided the ship into the center of the ring, the motion of the monoliths creating a strobe effect of shadow and light that disoriented his vision. Just as the docking sequence initiated, the silence of the void was shattered. A fleet of ships, led by the Authority's primary dreadnought and flanked by the salvaged cruisers of the Syndicate, dropped out of warp in a perfect hemispherical blockade. They had used the resonance of the first two nodes to track the Vanguard across the vacuum. The Authority's commander, a man of rigid principles and cold eyes named Harkin, broadcasted a high-priority demand for surrender. He spoke of the danger of uncontrolled technology and the necessity of state oversight for the anomalies they carried. Thuron didn't respond to the broadcast. He looked at Jorah, and in that moment there was no need for words. They had crossed the galaxy, faced the ghosts of the past, and carried the weight of a dead civilization on their shoulders. They weren't about to hand it over to a government that would weaponize the light or a syndicate that would sell the stars. Thuron slammed the final activation sequence into the console. The Vanguard erupted with a burst of violet energy that bridged the gap between the ship and the station's core. The monoliths began to spin with terrifying velocity, creating a centrifugal force that warped the very light around the station. The Authority opened fire, the heavy lance batteries striking the station's shields in a blinding display of kinetic fury. The Solstice groaned, the ancient metal and glass absorbing the impact and channeling the energy into the central vacuum. Thuron and Jorah abandoned the cockpit, racing toward the station's heart as the Vanguard acted as a lightning rod, drawing the enemy's fire away from the core. They reached the central chamber, a place where gravity was non-existent and the air was thick with the scent of ionizing radiation. At the center of the room sat the focal point, a spire of obsidian that reached toward a rift in the fabric of space-time. This was the gateway to the archive's full power, the switch that would turn the thousands of dormant nodes across the galaxy into a unified web of energy and knowledge. To activate it, the two cells they carried had to be merged within the spire's field. As they approached the focal point, the bulkhead behind them was blasted inward. Commander Harkin stepped through the smoke, flanked by a squad of elite shock troopers in heavy pressurized armor. He didn't fire, he simply held out his hand, his voice echoing in the hollow chamber. He told Thuron that they were playing with forces that had destroyed the Builders, that the hubris of the Ancients was a warning, not an invitation. Thuron looked at the spire, then back at Harkin. He replied that the Builders hadn't been destroyed by their technology, but by their realization that they were alone. He argued that the archive wasn't a weapon, but a bridge, a way for the fragmented species of the galaxy to finally speak the same language. The station shuddered violently as the Syndicate's cruisers began a suicidal ramming maneuver against the outer ring. The stability of the core was failing. Thuron realized that if they didn't merge the cells now, the resulting explosion would tear a hole in the galaxy that would never heal. He signaled to Jorah, who threw the containment box into the center of the spire's gravitational field. The box disintegrated instantly, releasing the two cells into the swirling violet vortex. Harkin ordered his men to fire, but the energy radiating from the spire created a localized stasis field, freezing the pulse bolts in midair. Thuron and Jorah reached out together, their hands touching the cold surface of the obsidian spire. They weren't just moving a piece of machinery, they were offering themselves as the final conduit. The archive's voice, now a chorus of millions of souls, flooded their minds, asking if they were ready to carry the burden of the light. The world vanished in a silent, blinding expansion of white. The solstice didn't explode, it transitioned. A wave of golden energy rippled out from the great silence, traveling faster than light, washing over the core Authority fleet, the Syndicate scavengers, and every inhabited world in the quadrant. It wasn't a wave of destruction, but of clarity. Across the galaxy, the hidden obsidian stations flared to life, their ancient symbols glowing in the dark. The energy didn't provide free power or ultimate weapons. It provided a connection, a shared neural substrate that allowed every sentient being to feel the weight of the stars and the fragility of life. The war in the Great Silence ended instantly, the pilots of the opposing fleets suddenly unable to find the hatred required to pull the trigger. Thuron and Jorah stood in the center of the now-quiet station, the spire gone, replaced by a steady, unwavering pillar of soft light that reached into the infinite. The vanguard of the void sat in the hangar, its obsidian plating now a permanent, shimmering gold. Harkin and his men had lowered their weapons, their faces filled with a confusion that was slowly turning into a strange, peaceful awe. The galaxy had changed in a single heartbeat. The dominion of the old powers hadn't been overthrown, it had simply become irrelevant in the face of the vastness they now understood. Thuron walked back to his ship, his movements slow and weary. He looked at Jorah, who was staring out at the distant smudge of the Milky Way. The stars didn't look cold anymore, they looked like a map of home. They had finished the work of the ancients, and in doing so, they had given the galaxy a second chance. Theron climbed into the pilot's seat and checked the console. The ship was ready, its systems hummed with a quiet, infinite grace. He didn't know where they would go next, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from anything. He engaged the thrusters, and the Vanguard drifted away from the solstice, moving back toward the cluster of stars they had once called the Outer Reach. The journey of the energy cells was over, but the story of the new era was just beginning. As they glided into the dark, Theron felt a sense of profound peace. The orbit of obsidian glass had led them through fire and shadow to the very edge of existence, only to show them that the greatest adventure was not in the finding of secrets, but in the sharing of them. He reached over and took Jorah's hand, the two of them watching as the golden light of the archive began to spread across the night sky like the first rays of a galactic dawn. The silence of the void was no longer empty. It was a canvas, waiting for the first words of a new history to be written.